If you were a crazy risk taker as a child, chances are your child is more likely to be someone who has a huge appetite for risk.
My next guest has been described as a mother rooting for all mothers. And I think we all need one of those in our camps when it comes to the teenage years, don't we? Trouble is, this is the time in our parenting journey when we're most likely to lose contact with the parents of our children's friends, or at least to stop talking about our problems so much because our kids are old enough to know we're talking about them and they don't like it. Daphne Adler has spent her professional career in management consulting. But as a parent to teenagers herself, she's used her analytical and consulting skills to support parents in a new book, Debunking Teenagers. In it, she gives us 200 research-based parenting strategies to help adolescents successfully navigate what she calls the tempteen years. The book answers the questions we've all got as parents of teenagers, like why are teenagers constantly tempted to behave recklessly? I know you've got an example in your head as you're hearing this. And what can parents do about it? Why is telling your son or daughter to just say no a hopelessly ineffective strategy? How can you keep your child safe behind the wheel? And the ultimate, why are teens constantly taking selfies? Daphne, welcome to Teenage Kicks.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Look, I'm fascinated. I couldn't say no to a book that tells me why my teenagers are taking risks and what I can do about it. Because I don't know about anyone else, but just reading that word tempteen is a bit of a reframe for me, because it helps me remember that risk-taking is completely normal for teenagers and not something to blame my own crap parenting for. Can you explain a bit more for us about that term?
Of course, yes. So the concept of a tempteen is quite a recent concept in a way. So a long time ago, there wasn't really a concept of teenage years. So in traditional societies, you would be a child initially, and then you would become a kind of adult almost abruptly when you would be drawn into doing work to help the households. You'd be an apprentice in some kind of craft. And so there wasn't really an opportunity for children to have a lot of leisure time and congregate and form groups with their own distinct identities. So it's really a modern phenomenon that we have this phase of life, which is called the teenage years. And in a way, when kids go through adolescence, that's their body preparing them to become an adult. But our society at the moment doesn't really allow them to do that immediately. We instead have this prolonged period where they're still studying, they're still learning, and it takes a lot longer really to be launched. So you had this mismatch a little bit between what we were designed to do biologically, which is break away from our parents when we go through puberty, and the modern reality that we're still living at home. And I think another reason that's getting exacerbated is that children are now going through puberty younger. No one really knows why this is happening, but over the last 50 to 100 years, the timing of puberty is shifting earlier and earlier. Lots of possible explanations could be environmental contaminants, things like that are, chemically sort of driving this change. But the big problem there is that the timing of puberty is what drives when children are drawn to risk taking.
Right.
And so it goes back to that, the kids historically who succeeded in life breaking away from their parents were the ones who took risks at that time and started their own families. And so the problem is now that when you go through puberty younger, you have this desire to take risks then, but your mind, your brain hasn't really developed sufficiently to have that kind of cognitive control to help you make sensible decisions. So your brain's cognitive control capacity develops over many years. Your brain isn't really fully formed till you're about 25 years old.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to pick up on next. I'll ask a stupid question, but how do you think kids who transitioned abruptly to adulthood, as you've described it in the past, were able to make that navigation? Were their brains maturing before 25? What's changed there? Because it feels like when you describe it, it feels like we've set our kids up, whether we haven't done it intentionally, but nature has set our kids up these days to really struggle in those years, kind of 11 to 25, because that makes total sense. They're designed to risk take and get on with their lives, but society doesn't let them. And society doesn't let them, presumably because it's been proven that their brains aren't really ready for it until they're 25.
Well, I would say, first of all, kids rise to the challenges that you throw at them. And so definitely if you expect them to be more self-sufficient, if you don't do their laundry for them, they will realize I need to do it. So, part of it is that we're depriving them of those challenges and the opportunities to rise to those challenges by treating them like children, when in fact they have the capabilities to be more mature than that.
Yeah, good point.
So I think that's a lot of it. But also I think that our modern society has very different demands on us ultimately. We're required in our, modern world to use our cognitive capacities in a very different way, right? A lot of our work is desk-based, analytical, rather than, practical and out in the world. And so, I think our modern system of education does prepare children well for the jobs of today. But the jobs of today are, of course, very different than they used to be in more traditional societies.
So I'm imagining that when you were 12 years old in the cave bear age, you needed to take risks because you needed to get out and get on with the job of killing for food and foraging and like you say, creating fire and setting up families, which requires a great deal of emotional and mental strength. So
yeah, exactly. It's even funny to observe with teenagers and sleep. So I don't know if you've noticed this with your own children, but teenagers start staying up later and waking up later.
Yeah.
But that's universal across all cultures. And they find that there's this shift in the timing of sleep. And that's all about when their sleep hormones kick in. And so you can put a teenager to bed early, but they will lie awake staring at the ceiling because the melatonin hasn't kicked in. And the theory behind that is that teenagers, that was the years when you needed to go out and, start your own family, and you needed time out of the observation of the adults around you to be able to go do that. So children and adults go to sleep at a normal time, whereas teenagers stay up late. And there's a biological reason.
So what you're really saying is that our teenagers are supposed to be out till midnight, hunting for the opposite sex.
Yes, exactly.
Oh my God. I'm right. I sense hundreds of thousands of parents tuning out right now. Oh, la. I don't want to hear about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
But we need to dig into that. So, what you were saying a minute ago made me think that our teenagers are capable of doing their own laundry and cleaning their own rooms and making their own food if it's provided for them. And what prevents them, because it is us as parents, because I got an instinctive kind of like punch in the gut when you said that. Like, oh God, I would hate that. So is it us that gets in the way of what they're trying to do, and is that detrimental?
I suppose so, yes. I mean, you do have an increasing rate of what we can jokingly call failure to launch, right? So higher percentages of children are living at home after university. They are, during university, calling home all the time. They are, asking their parents to intervene when they have an issue with the school. I mean, and all these things we're of course enabling, right? And so it's sort of our job in a way as the parent of teenagers to step back and let them make their own mistakes a bit and learn from the practical realities of life rather than shielding them from it.
Yeah, I'm just making a note of that because you've already given me 2 sound bites that I want to share with people about this podcast. You're speaking my language, because that is, much as I haven't wanted to let my kids go, something kind of cognitively has told me that it's the right thing to do. And where I've been brave enough to do it, it has largely worked. Not seamlessly, not smoothly, not without pain on both sides, but I can look back and say that was absolutely the right thing to do, to let them go. And actually my newsletter this month is about letting kids grow up, which involves pain.
Sure. I guess the only caveat I'd put to that is that the very young teens who've gone through puberty early and their brains aren't really controlling them yet, they'll be too drawn to risks. And so you do need to let them learn social skills and interact with kids their age, but supervision is helpful. Like I said, historically, children didn't congregate. They spent time with other competent adults. And so having your kids spend time with competent adults is quite a good thing.
Yeah, there's a book called Hold On to Your Kids that I read recently. I can't remember who the author is. Is it Gabor Mate? No. Anyway, I'll figure it out and put it in the show notes. Which caused me a lot of stress because the premise was that historically, children would have been far more affiliated with their families, their parents, the other adults in the wider family and community until a much older age. And that would have been their greatest source of influence. So they would have been coached in adult strategies for life. Whereas now there's so much more disconnect, and school doesn't help with that. The affinity and the place that teenagers go to for their support network is more immature teenagers. Let's just be blunt about it. And that's really detrimental. And I thought, oh, crap, that is what I've encouraged. I encourage my kids to get out there and be with their friends.
There are benefits to both, right? They can learn from their friends, social skills, and they can learn from adults, how to behave like a sensible person. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So, you've kind of explained why teenagers are constantly tempted to behave recklessly. What can we as parents do about that?
Well, so there are many different strategies, and it depends on what problem you're trying to solve. I mean, I think, when it comes to hurting themselves, probably the top danger facing them is driving. So,
yeah.
Unfortunately, we aren't as scared as we should be by the concept of driving because we do it all the time. So it seems just every day. And, driving accidents are unlikely. But in the grand scheme of things, if someone's going to suffer an untimely death, the most dangerous year of their life is when they're 17. And the reason is because they get their license then.
Right.
The issue is that kids drive very competently when there's an adult in the car. But the minute they get their license and there's no supervision, their crash rates just go spiking up for about 3 months or so. And it's because they're so excited about having this newfound freedom that they start just behaving like idiots. Basically, they start speeding, they rapidly accelerate, and they swerve, and they careen around corners, and they race each other. And that's when they end up really hurting themselves. So in terms of really practical tips about how you can prevent that, I mean, the best one is actually to get a device that you can put in your car that will monitor their driving behavior. So a lot of insurance companies will give you a monitoring system that can be put in the car. And it's really a win-win because they will charge you lower premiums for a teenage driver. But also and the reason they do that is because it actually lowers the chance your kid will crash, because it's like having an avatar of you sitting in the car with them, right? They know someone's basically watching what they're doing, and then they drive a lot more safely. So that's like a really practical way you can keep your child safe when they're driving.
Great way to look at it, an avatar of you. So they call it like a black box, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are also ones that use like smartphone technology that aren't quite as effective, but they can work too. So the idea is just to make a practical barrier to them behaving stupidly in that case.
Yeah. I've got a funny story on that. A friend of mine's daughter passed her driving test, and she had one of these kind of so-called black boxes in the car. And also, top tip, if you are looking to insure a teenager on your car, it's much better for them to be added for you to be added as a driver on their insurance policy. That also takes your cost down quite significantly, because it is extortionate what teenagers cost for car insurance. Actually, I'm just thinking out loud. I think that actually making them pay for their own insurance if they've got some kind of a part-time job might also prevent them from taking too many risks in the car, because they'll get hit hard where it will hurt them most.
I love that. Yes.
In an emotional capacity. But the funny story is that this mom that I know, she shares this car with her daughter, and she constantly finds herself speeding, like literally just 1 mile over the speed limit, and like which happens. I mean, all right, I'm just admitted to breaking the law. That's terrible. I don't do it deliberately, but occasionally you will drift over the 30 miles an hour for a moment. And she's like, it is so hard to keep it under, but I have to, because otherwise her insurance will get invalidated.
I love it.
So it improves our driving too. So win-win, like you said. Um, yeah, so that you kind of answered the driving question. What else can we do generally when our teenagers are just well, I love that term, behaving recklessly, because I know so many parents who get up every day wondering what their child is going to do next to frustrate them, cause them stress, create an issue that they're going to have to fix for them, and tearing their hair out. What can we do generally when that's the teenager that we've got on our plates?
Well, I mean, certainly it's hard. A lot of risk taking is genetic. So if you if you were a crazy risk taker as a child, chances are your child is more likely to be someone who has a huge appetite for risk. I would say in those circumstances, if you have a teenager who's more likely to want to drive their car fast than to stay at home and, read a book, arguably what you want to do is channel their desire to take risks into forms that are going to be less dangerous. So rather than speeding their car, you could try to get them involved in, rock climbing or whitewater rafting or, something where they get that thrill, but actually statistically it's less likely to harm them. Some kids just are naturally drawn to extreme sports, but you want to keep them away from base jumping and instead encourage them, to do, something that's a little bit statistically more safe, to get that risk appetite out of their system.
Yeah. I wonder if it's a chemical thing and the dopamine hit comes into play here, because my kids, they're not into risky sports, extreme sports, but they're both really good skiers. And they absolutely love a ski trip. It gives them, they will describe the rush that it gives them. And that is it actually is. I think it's the most dangerous sport, second to horse riding.
Yeah, it depends on how you define danger. I mean, wrestling is actually how you end up the most in the emergency room.
Oh, really? Is that true?
Yeah. So in my book, I have a whole analysis of different activities and things. But yes, skiing is quite dangerous. Wearing a helmet can mitigate a lot of, some of the risk. Obviously, not all of it, but in terms of head injuries, anytime they're doing anything super active, helmets are crucial. Bicycling, motorcycle, don't even let your child near a motorcycle. That's one of my absolute hard. So a kid's 85 times more likely to crash a motorcycle than a car. I mean, they're just so dangerous. If there's one thing I'd say, keep your child away from, it would be that's like a hard no.
Yes. Yeah. Well, on that note, so hard no's are really difficult to get past our kids sometimes. Yes. And most of us, I think, know from experience that when we've issued a hard no, if that teenager, and actually some children, is not on board with that hard no in some way that is motivated by their own sense of what they want in their life, they will find a way past that hard no, whatever you do.
Yes.
But is there any I've often thought, all right, look, I save my hard no's for the things that I absolutely will not tolerate. Tattoos was one of them with mine, and one of them's found a way past that already, and they're both working on me for another one. So it clearly wasn't hard enough.
Yeah.
But if I save my hard no's for the stuff that really matters to me, does that mean that my kids are going to make more sensible choices elsewhere, or am I just diluting the pot?
I completely agree with you that you want to save the no's for the things that really matter. I mean, it also, as an aside, I'll say there are ways to say no more effectively. So just on that, a few tips about how to say no. I mean, the first is listen. So when you listen to your teen and repeat back what they've said, it makes them feel like you've respected their point of view, and they're more likely to be therefore open to what you might have to say later. Also often not saying no immediately, but saying I'm going to take some time to think about this, and then coming back to them with the no makes you, again, feel more reasonable, and they'll see you as less stubborn and more, thoughtful. And keeping cool, obviously, if you're getting into kind of an altercation, then stepping away and discussing it later can help. And also sticking together with your partner, if you have a spouse, deciding beforehand what you're going to say so that kids can't play you off of each other, go to one and then go to the other. That's always good. And then finally kind of offering evidence. So definitely not comparing your teen with other people, but you can kind of say, here are the consequences of mistakes that other people have made, that might help in terms of bringing them around to your point of view. And then in terms of things to say no to, so I mentioned driving already. I would say, so I did an analysis for my book of, how do teens end up, in the emergency room or dead? How do they end up with kind of lifelong things they might regret someday? And I kind of said, what are the most dangerous issues facing teens today? And what was interesting is the one that actually came out top of the list, much to my surprise in a way, was alcohol. And it's not because it can contribute to teens getting into trouble while they're teenagers, but it's also actually just about the risk of long-term alcoholism. And the issue here is that teenagers are actually more susceptible to becoming alcoholics. And, the rate of alcoholism is very, is higher than it should be. About 10% of adult men and 5% of adult women are alcoholics.
Wow.
So, lots of people who drank as teenagers turned out fine. I mean, maybe you did yourself. But if society as a whole were more restrictive, rates of alcoholism and premature deaths from alcohol would go down. So just to give you a bit more detail on that, because, for example, my husband was sort of shocked by this recommendation and saying, really, aren't you being kind of, moralistic, or, it's not about that. So a great example is Italy. There's only one country in the whole of the Western world where alcoholism is a non-issue, and that's Italy. And it's because the Italians have just a completely different relationship with alcohol. So their wine is like a part of an everyday meal. Kids are always allowed to sip a little bit. There's no taboo at all. So the question is, why can't we all just act like the Italians? And a lot of parents in the UK think, therefore, the right approach is let my kids sip some alcohol at dinner, model good drinking behavior, right? And it makes intuitive sense. The problem is it's not actually that simple. So it's really hard to import an entire culture into a different cultural context. And you don't really realize, but by the time your kids are teenagers, their views on alcohol have already been informed by lots of messages from television, movies, books, and even real life. You have characters like Mrs. Doubtfire or Smee and Peter Pan, and, even Dumbo, who, gets drunk by mistake. So by the time kids are teenagers, they've learned that alcohol is taboo in their society, and they've learned it's possible to get very drunk. And like in Italy, where there aren't examples like that. So very perversely allowing your kids to sip alcohol at home can really backfire. Kids outside of Italy who sip under their parents' supervision are actually more likely to develop a drinking problem. It seems like if kids know that, they know drinking is taboo in their society, but their parents are letting them sip anyway, then they kind of wrongly conclude that it's fine for them to drink even more when they're out of eyesight, right? Their parents think this is okay.
Yeah.
And so the other issue is that the younger kids start drinking, the more chance they will have a problem with alcohol later. There's something about the younger brain that makes it much more vulnerable to becoming addicted. It's obviously not ethical to experiment on humans, but we know this for a couple of reasons from studies of animals. Younger animal brains are much more vulnerable to being damaged by alcohol. And they also rewire more quickly to find alcohol really pleasurable and addictive. But there are also examples in humans. So if you look at identical twins, if one twin starts drinking earlier, that twin is more likely to become an alcoholic. And you see it in the real world too. For more than 40% of kids started drinking when they were 14 became alcoholics, versus only about 10% of those who started when they were 20. Yeah.
Wow.
So there's something about the brain that's just really susceptible when kids are younger. So you just want to keep them off it as long as you can. I mean, obviously it's hard when they go to university.
Right.
Bets are off, right? But while they're at home, try your best not to. So practical questions.
That's huge. Sorry. 40% if they start at 14, and I would say I have anecdotal experience
Yeah.
of kids that I know drinking at that age because it's seen as taboo, as you said, illicit, and you need to break away from your
Yeah,
parents and do illicit
of course.
things. It's readily available and it's
Yeah.
fun.
Yeah, of course.
That's enormous. I read a statistic once about no alcohol at all should pass their lips until they're beyond 15. There's something about the brain at 15 that before 15 it can't tolerate alcohol safely at all. I'm not quite sure what the rationale for that was. I mean, this one always gets me a little bit because my daughter, I actively encouraged her to start drinking at 16.
Yeah.
And she actually didn't until she felt like it. But that's because she has type 1 diabetes, and you mix alcohol with insulin, it can be very, very, very dangerous. And I wanted her to have plenty of practice before she was on her own at university, which she is now, and she's managing fine. So in one sense, I've done a really good thing to help her know how to drink safely and keep herself alive. But in another, I've potentially supported her in risk taking, which might have been a bad decision. It's so difficult.
Of course. And like I said, plenty of people who drink young turn out completely fine. It's more just
Yeah.
overall, if we could all as a society do this, it would help, you know, and everyone knows their own child best, right? It's not that some children are probably more risk takers than others. You know, you as a parent, you know intuitively what your child is like. It's more just, I think, sometimes it's easy to be naive and assume, oh, my child would never do such a thing. And actually, you know, kids can be pretty devious outside of their parents.
Well, on that point, and I know, sorry, I interrupted you, so we'll go back to your point around alcohol again. But on that point, I think it's worth just underlining for anyone listening that if you, I think it was my guest, Dr. Richard Pyle, who's a couple of episodes back from you. His biggest quote was, if you think that your child is telling you everything about their life, you are completely deluded.
Absolutely.
They are definitely going to do things that you A, don't know about, and B, definitely don't want them to do.
Oh, it's awful. There's so many great studies where they survey parents and they survey teens, and the parents say one thing and then the teens completely contradict them. You know, it's just awful. Like,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And is that okay? That's the question I've got. Do we just need to make our peace with that? Because I feel like a lot of the conflict that happens between parents and teenagers is because we're trying to control and keep hold of and keep them safe. But really, actually, this is what I talk about a lot in my coaching work. It's about making ourselves feel safe when we try to control what they're doing. It's more about that than it is about keeping them safe. Yeah. It's that kind of acceptance, just something that we will all benefit from if we can get there.
Yeah, I mean, I think in practice, not being naive and just assuming they might behave badly and then planning accordingly is probably the best strategy. So actually, that ties me nicely back into my points about alcohol. So you can tell your kid not to drink, but they're probably not going to listen to you, right? If they're with friends and they want to impress them. So it's really about practical. That, you know, most of my recommendations are super practical. So on the alcohol front, you know, the first step is lock up your alcohol cabinet. So when you survey young drinkers about where they got their liquor from, it's cupboards at home. You know, their parents never notice. So most people can't keep perfect track of how full every bottle is. And, you know, anyway, it's pretty easy to like replace the vodka with a bit of water. You know, you probably wouldn't notice, right? Another practical step is colluding with the parents of your kids' friends. So it's natural to feel worried about being the only stickler. Like you don't want to be the bad cop and everyone else is the good cop. But weirdly, most parents overestimate other parents' approval of underage drinking. So it's one of those silly situations where everyone assumes everyone else is more lenient. So then, you know, no one wants to be the bad cop. But if you can coordinate and work together, it's actually very possible. If you all lock up your alcohol cabinets, you can succeed in keeping kids away from the alcohol. And then, you know, kids, it's worth talking to your child, right? So you wouldn't think your kid would necessarily listen, but there's a nice example where parents who talked to their kids about drinking before they went off to university, those kids were less likely to binge drink once they got there. So, there's no harm in trying. No.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really good practical conversation around alcohol, and I think that is a problem that most parents of teenagers are going to worry about at some point. So it's really useful to explore a bit more deeply. I'm interested by one of the questions that you say you can address in your book is, why is telling your son or daughter to just say no a hopelessly ineffective strategy? I'd love to know what your take on that is.
Yeah. So the problem with just say no is that, when kids are in a situation, the reason kids often will take a drug or, experiment with something is because they want to impress their friends and look cool. And, they're not thinking about their longevity at that point, because what's actually more important to them right at that moment is, is saving face and being cool. And so what's far better is to arm your kids in advance with strategies they can use when they're put in those awkward peer situations, right? So if their friends are pressuring them to drink alcohol, and they can say, oh, I can't because I have a sports match tomorrow, or because my parents insist that I wake them up when I come home and they will smell on my breath instantly and I'll be in horrible trouble. Or, you can help them come up with excuses. You can give them suggestions like, well, you could fill your cup. You could empty your cup in the bathroom and fill it with water, and everyone will still think it's alcohol. Or, there are ways that you can give kids just practical ways to push back on that kind of peer pressure in the moment. And the other thing is that the concept of saying no, a lot of kids do say no initially, and then they get pushed even further. There's, in fact, when kids are offering another kid a substance, there's usually an audience involved. So it's in front of peers and they're being pressured into doing something. And it's so funny when it comes to the concept of like peer pressure. There's so much research about how to help kids, resist peer pressure. There's almost no research about why kids exert peer pressure. Like, what are they trying to achieve by insisting? Like, is it because they're trying to look cool, saying, oh, I condone this taboo behavior, I'm going to force you to do it too? Is it like a display of dominance? We're not really sure, but it is a performance and there's an audience. And so your child needs to then be prepared for how they're going to respond in that moment, because most kids on the spot aren't able to think of a good comeback or a way to avoid the situation, which is a shame. So they often say no, and then when they're pressed, then they end up saying yes because they're stuck. Yeah.
Well, I've got a theory on that, and it goes back to the biological prehistoric thing as well, that it's about the need to belong, because if we don't belong, then we're effectively alone, and historically that would have meant failure. We would have died if we hadn't belonged.
I absolutely agree with you. I think that's spot on. And teenagers have formed their own little tribe, right? And they're trying to fit in. I mean, that's like the tattooing. It's like a visible badge of like, I'm part of this tribe, and they feel a powerful need to belong and to be respected by their peers, which you have to acknowledge. And, it's a rational behavior on their part in a way, right? So when someone starts smoking, they're, they're trying to fit in. They're not thinking about how they're going to feel when they're 70, because that's not relevant. What they need to do now is succeed in their current life, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's so compelling. I mean, it's even hard for me to resist sometimes we're people pleasers for a good reason.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah. But it's really sad because sometimes, like with the smoking, often even your very first cigarette can trigger this continuous physical addiction. Nicotine is the second or third most addictive substance in the world, and it doesn't harm them in the short term, but obviously does in the long term. And so kids don't realize that they're almost making a decision for life when they agree to take the cigarette, right? Because most people assume they're going to quit later, and then most people try to quit later and are completely unable to do so, and then end up regretting it, right? Which is such a shame.
Because it's so addictive. And as a non-smoker, I never really understood that. They were like, well, it doesn't taste very nice, so why would you not just stop? But it's the physical effect or the physiological effect it has on your body, right? So nicotine, I think alcohol. What's the other one? The top three most addictive things? Because we all imagine heroin.
Yeah, so the top two are, addicted. There's actually many components to addiction. There's kind of psychological addiction, like I want to do this again. There's physical addiction, like I crave it. There's withdrawal if you stop taking it. So there's many ways to measure it, but generally speaking, it's crack, cocaine, and heroin are the only two that are more physically addictive than nicotine.
The nicotine, right. So nicotine's even ahead of alcohol.
Yes. And what's fascinating is that you can actually predict, based on how someone responds to their very first cigarette, how likely they are to become a chain smoker. So people who feel like a rush or a buzz or who feel more relaxed are way more likely to escalate and smoke a lot than people who just cough and splutter and feel sick. So that's genetic, right?
On their first cigarette. Because I just assumed everybody hates it the first time. I remember having one when I was probably 16 and just feeling like a complete idiot because I couldn't breathe in front of my friends. So that put me off forever.
Yeah, well, you were lucky, right? But some people get a real buzz and that feels really good. And those are the people who, even after a couple of days, can start getting hooked and their brain kind of will permanently adapt and they'll crave it then for the rest of their lives, basically.
Wow.
Which is tough, right?
Huge.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a lot to say on how to stop smoking as well, if you're interested to hear.
Oh, well, that might be another podcast. We definitely could do with an expose on effective ways to quit addictions. But I'm interested to get onto a couple of the other points that you mentioned about bullies and victims. So reforming bullies and supporting victims is a strategy that schools use, that parents use.
Yes.
And you say it misses the point.
Yes.
Tell us more about that.
Absolutely. So bullies, the problem with bullying is that bullies are unfortunately often perceived as cool and powerful and popular by their peers. And they use bullying to help them gain prestige. And so classmates may kind of avoid their company because they realize they're not very nice, but it can actually help. I mean, it can even help improve their standing with the other sex, like bullying does pay in an adolescent environment. But it's a performance. And the key to stopping the show isn't with either the actors, the bully, or the victim. It's with the audience. So just as I was talking about with the Just Say No issue, about 85% of bullying episodes are in front of a crowd. And if the classmates standing around react positively to the way the bully is behaving, then the bully will escalate. And if they challenge it, then the bully backs down. The problem is most kids actually do disapprove of bullying, but it's typically easier to be quiet than to take the risk of looking foolish or even, becoming a target of the bully themselves. But then the problem is that kids then incorrectly assume that the others who are silent are condoning the bullying. And so it's this vicious circle where everyone assumes everyone else approves of it. And then effectively the group does approve it. Right. But the good thing is that kids are actually very acutely sensitive to the attitudes of the other bystanders. And so, for example, if you're the parent of a child who is just naturally confident and, popular, that's the kind of child who can make a big difference in these situations. Because if someone like that is willing to spend a little bit of their social capital, you might call it, to intervene, then that can drastically change the incidence of the bullying. So if you think your child, the most common problem is you think your child's being bullied, right? The best probably approach is to ask the school, because there are anti-bullying programs that play on exactly that. It's about like being an upstander rather than a bystander and trying to encourage the confident kids to, speak out. Failing that, a high risk, but maybe potentially useful strategy could be to try to find out who are the students at school who are both popular and also kind, and sort of ask maybe a teacher to approach them in confidence to see if they would intervene. You definitely don't want it to be obvious the teacher is involved, because that can really undermine the situation. It's really sad because a lot of kids who are being bullied never tell an adult. And it's funny, when adults put together lists of like how to help kids being bullied, their suggestions are always, go to a counselor, go to a teacher, go to your parent. Kids don't do that. They don't do that, because if they tattle, it makes it even worse. Then they lose even more social standing, and the bully is going to come after them even more. It backfires massively, so that kids can't, right? But if you can do it behind the scenes and try to get allies who are their peers to help, it can make a huge benefit. Also the more drastic courses, even trying to get them out of that peer situation, moving schools, or, that can help, because sometimes it's really arbitrary. Kids can get off to the wrong foot at the start just for some random small reason. But then once someone's been branded as a victim, it's very hard to escape from that. So sometimes a fresh start can really help. I know that's not feasible in a lot of circumstances.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if I guess it's, again, really, really high risk for them, or feels high risk. But if the kids who are being bullied do know who the popular people are who are kind, I'm wondering if they could be encouraged to, is it an effective strategy for them to approach those kids themselves and try and, because I think this is what happens. Kids form groups of safe people, and there's jostling that goes on within those groups, but they reach a level that is tolerable for them, and they stick with that. They tolerate what kids like to call banter, what we also call banter, and I've got a real issue with that word, because it's only banter if it's tolerable for you and you find it fun as well. And it can very quickly cross over into bullying, which is not acceptable. But my sense is that kids kind of band together in groups that feel just about secure enough to protect them from having to be at the mercy of people outside of that group who would otherwise pick on them, isolate them, and turn them into a victim.
Yeah.
Is that an effective strategy, or is that far too high risk for any child to take?
I think it's just unrealistic that a kid, I mean, typically kids are being bullied. The reason they're being bullied is because they are slightly socially awkward in some way, right?
Sure.
It's asking a lot to approach someone who has a higher social status and ask for help. I mean, that could also, as you say, it could backfire. I just don't think it's likely the kids would take that action. I mean, even if it would help them, I think it's improbable. But that's why the kind of behind the scenes, but ideally, really, a teacher can make a big difference in terms of creating a culture in a school where, bystanders stand up and, don't let this stuff happen.
Yeah, no, you've got me interested in bullying generally and campaigns. I don't need another campaign.
I mean, on that subject, though, there's kind of another offshoot of bullying is harassment. I mean, a lot of kids, especially girls, are getting harassed at school and sexual harassment and stuff. And a big problem there is that a lot of the people doing it actually don't realize that that's what they're doing. So when you interview kids, boys who've admitted to harassment, they think it's not a big deal, or they say they're trying to be funny. They'll say things like, oh, girls love it. They just don't want to admit it. Or, if a girl hits on a guy, he doesn't get upset. It makes his day, But actually, about 2/3 of young women who get these comments say they feel offended or scared or angry. And so there's just this disconnect. A lot of kids who are probably good kids at heart just don't realize that what they're doing is coming across as kind of bullying or harassing behavior. So there's something about, if you have a son, it's worth having that conversation just so they don't make that.
Oh my goodness. Absolutely. Yeah. And boys of sisters are more fortunate because they get told by their sisters. Yes. This is my experience.
Yes.
Yeah. And whilst we're on the subject, there's an episode that I recorded a while back with Tony Hargis on how to stand up for yourself. It's mostly in the workplace, but it equates to schools as well, in the face of sexual harassment. And I mean, she is a very active campaigner on social media, but it's quite a useful episode for anybody who feels like they're experiencing that, and for any adolescent boys who think it's no big deal. It's a good listen. So that kind of leads me on to one of the other questions that you talk about addressing in your book. The issues that children are facing online. I don't want to turn this into a big debate about social media and whether we should control our children's access to it or not. We do talk about that in probably most episodes of this podcast. But what interested me in your question was, what are the real perils that children are facing online, rather than the imagined fears that we as parents who didn't grow up in a digital age have?
Yes, of course. I mean, so, I go through in my book every possible problem they could face, from, cyberbullying to video game addiction to gambling, identity theft. I mean, there are lots of perils out there. I mean, the one I don't emphasize is actually the whole concept of, grooming and online predators, because actually it's a red herring. I mean, kids are meeting strangers online, but they tend to be people their own age. And, when they do meet up with them offline, it tends to be no different than if they've met any other strangers at a party, offline. it's not that there's any specific danger there. I think it's more a question of time, usage of time. I think kids are teenagers in particular, are at this amazing age where their brains are just sponges. They can learn so much so quickly and easily. And if they're spending a lot of their time online, that's time they're not spending doing other things, more traditional activities. And of course, people say, oh, I need to interact with my friends and my friends are online. I mean, that's what's a shame, right? Is that, it used to be humans learned by looking at each other face to face, and now they're interacting only on a screen. And the downside of that is that our kids are not learning the kind of social skills and ability to read emotions and faces, that is actually really important to learn. It's really tough, I think, as a parent facing this issue because, you don't want your child to be the pariah. You don't want your child to be the only one who doesn't have access and all their friends are online. I think that's where I would say it's the headmaster or mistress of your school that is actually the person who's the most critical, because the school sets the culture. And it's fascinating how some schools ban devices entirely from the premises.
Yeah.
And at those schools, children interact face to face, whereas other schools absolutely freely allow devices. And that's when you have kids, in the same room as each other interacting over a device, right? Yeah. And so I think if I were a parent wanting to make a dent in this issue, I would be trying to advocate with the leader of my child's school, because it's a society-wide phenomenon. And the only way we can make a shift is if everybody shifts, not if one parent, insists on stricter guidelines for the children.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's huge. And I tend to take the view that it is, a digital presence, a digital future. It's just part of life now. It's not something that we can avoid, shut down, keep our kids away from. And I do know people who very bravely are saying no smartphones until their children are 16, 17, 18, whatever it is. And they're sticking with it for very, very good reasons. I would have found that too difficult. And I would have, my preference is to try and teach my kids how to manage online stuff, social media, as part of their everyday lives. But I absolutely get your point that it's a time suck. And it's interesting, my daughter's now 19 and very, very busy with her friends and her work in university. And she will say to me, and she was one that, we've had arguments about her screen time, but she'll say to me, as soon as you end up in a more adult situation with a lot of responsibilities, that she has a part-time job, well, actually it's more full-time when she's home in the holidays. You don't do that anymore. You stay away. I don't have time for TikTok. I very rarely look at TikTok because I'm too busy. And I think I'm really heartened by that when it comes to be my son's term to move into that phase, because I still see him on his phone a lot. And I think there's something for parents in knowing that all this, like many other adolescent things, there may be an element of it just being a phase.
Yeah.
And they don't need to 100% panic that their kids' lives are destroyed and their eyesight's going to go because they're going to spend 100% of their time online and not get a job and be a complete waster. It's probably not true. But that's not how it feels in the moment. So your point about just doing anything we can to engage them offline in the interim, to remind them of the importance of that, is really important. We have covered quite a lot. What we didn't cover, but I think I know what your answer is going to be, because you've talked about it already, is why teenagers are constantly taking selfies. And it is constant. So my daughter's not on TikTok, but the way she communicates, well, she is on TikTok, but she's not there very often. But the way she communicates with her friends on social apps like Snapchat, etc., is by sending them a selfie. She doesn't even type anything or say anything to them. She just sends them a selfie, and it's a reaction. She's permanently taking photos. Tell me about that.
Well, it's not, I mean, the selfie specifically is new, but the phenomenon is not new. Like, teenagers have been obsessed with their appearance as long as they've been humans, right? And
true.
And the problem with it is that attractiveness actually does matter. When you think about it, it's unfortunate, but it's true, members of both sexes who are unattractive are less likely to get married. People who are good looking are more popular. They date more. They also achieve greater professional success, earn higher wages. It's depressing. And kind of beauty discrimination starts early. So this is a sad anecdote, but if a report card has a picture of an attractive child, then a teacher is more likely to interpret it more favorably and assume the kid has a higher IQ and is more likely to succeed.
Oh,
horrible.
my God.
It's horrible, right? But also I think kids' personalities are being shaped by their friends during their teenage years, and kids who develop social confidence when they're teenagers during this kind of critical window of their personality forming tend to carry their confidence later with them for life. So it actually does matter how kids look. I wish it didn't, and it shouldn't, but it does. And so, it's easy to sort of dismiss it, but actually, if your child has glasses, helping them get contact lenses, or, if you can pay for fixing their dental situation, braces and Invisalign and things are very expensive, but it's awful. But it's true that kids who have orthodontic treatment earn 6 to 7% more as adults than those who don't. Isn't that crazy? So this stuff matters. Then you come to like acne. I mean, acne is obviously the scourge of teenagers, and most folk remedies don't help at all. So actually seeing a dermatologist is the way to go. So if you can afford these things, helping your child, helping your ugly duckling become a swan can actually help them for life. I mean, which is.
Yeah. Well, so I remember worrying about my appearance and confiding in my mum when I was young, and she just always brushed it off as, it's puppy fat, it's this, it's that, you're beautiful inside. All of that is really irrelevant when you're a teenager struggling with body image issues or self-esteem issues. Yeah. You've just mentioned acne. We do have an episode with a lady who still has acne in middle age, and she talks about exactly the same as you've just said, about take it seriously. Don't indulge Mandy's hips are smaller than mine type conversations. But if there's something you can practically do, like fix teeth, acne, hair, whatever it is for them. I know a lot of girls, they get really upset about body hair at a young age. And in fact, I've written about that on my blog. Teenagers, parents of younger girls are quite rightly really destroyed about the thought of helping their child to remove hair from their body because everything about them's perfect. But if it's really causing self-esteem issues, it's really not a big deal.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
Oh, Daphne, I could talk to you forever, and I'm going to buy your book as soon as it comes out. Tell me when it's available in the UK, and where people can find you if they'd like to connect.
Yeah, so May 20th, it'll be available on Amazon. And I have a website, debunkingteenagers.com. There's a way to get in touch with me there. So yeah, I would welcome people getting in touch. I'd love to hear what people think about all of these issues.
Fantastic. Is there anything else that we've not discussed that you think is a burning issue that people need to know about?
I mean, there are hundreds, like I said, 200 strategies. My book is filled with topics. Pretty much any topic you get me talking. My book is quite exhaustive, so it's sort of more of a reference guide. Like I do start with what I think are the top 10, issues, so that people can then, go directly to those if they want. But then I'm not sure it's a book you'd read straight through. It's more a book if there's something you're concerned about or thinking about. It covers pretty much every subject that I could think of, certainly on the subject of teens.
Useful. Yeah. A dip in and out book when you've got problems, because that's effectively what we do. We just go to Dr. Google as soon as we're stressed about something our child's doing.
There we go.
And we get all sorts of answers that may or may not be helpful. Yeah. So that's a good starting point as a reference. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been really, really interesting.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. Thank you too to everyone who's already rated and reviewed the podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Amazon, it would mean the world to me if you could leave a review. It really helps get the word out, as well as making me very happy to read what you have to say. If this episode strikes a chord for you, please share it with anyone else you know who might be in the same boat, and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. If you have a story or a suggestion for something you'd like to see covered on the podcast, you can email me at teenagekickspodcast@gmail.com. or message me on Instagram. I am Helen Woods. I love hearing from all my listeners. It really makes a difference to me on this journey. See you next week when I'll be chatting to another brilliant guest about the highs and lows of parenting teens. Bye for now.